This paper is part of a larger book project in which I explore two major approaches used in teaching about cultural difference, one found in anthropology, the other typical of interculturalists. And the book is actually a translation exercise, or following this morning, an interpretation exercise, where I'm trying to translate intercultural for anthros and anthropology for interculturalists. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding that goes on about what each is trying to do and what each is actually doing. My own context is actually an interdisciplinary program. And so I think a lot about how to articulate the value of anthropology to economists and political scientists and others, and also to how to articulate the value of those approaches to anthropologists. As this conference is concerned specifically with interrogating possible futures for anthropologists in schools of education, my focus today is on key distinctions between these two approaches that are likely to be important in shaping that future. Since our time is short, today I will briefly touch on three things. First, I'll outline, very briefly, the divergent histories of anthropology in the intercultural field. Then I'll explore key differences in the pedagogy typical of each. Finally, I turn to the implications for teaching and assessing cultural and intercultural competence, both learning outcomes that often now guide conversations about how to teach people about cultural difference. I'll do this in terms of the kind of learning each approach best supports. I'll also look at the usefulness, specifically for anthropologists, of understanding the strengths and weaknesses of both approaches for pedagogical purposes to help us teach better, and for instrumental ones to help us ensure that the value and relevance of anthropology and anthropologists is recognized by colleagues from other disciplines and other academic professionals. Intercultural communication first emerged as a distinct area of study in the 1950s. Anthropologist Edward T. Hall, widely considered the father of the field, laid its foundations by building on the work of Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, and Edward Sapir, among others. He integrated their psychologically oriented anthropology with attention to social dynamics, to culture and action. Hall focused his attention on mid-level social analysis, on interactions. He was interested in the ways in which culture shapes interactions, specifically intercultural interactions. Hall went beyond multicultural analysis, which examines multiple possible cultural configurations, and cross-cultural analysis, which looks at specific cases of intercultural contact. Rather, Hall was interested in what could be learned, generally, ethically, about what happens in interactions between individuals from different cultures. This central concern has remained at the core of the intercultural field ever since. Perhaps because he spent so much time in applied contexts, such as working for the US State Department and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Hall was committed to developing tools and frameworks that would help people function more effectively in intercultural situations. To Hall, theory and practice were intrinsically linked. Over the course of the next decades, as Hall elaborated upon his ideas, anthropologists gave them a mixed reception. This was perhaps due in part to Hall's applied emphasis, in part to his somewhat idiosyncratic language for conveying his rather complex ideas, and in part to larger currents within the discipline. Regardless of the causes, as Hall continued to participate in the development of the rapidly growing intercultural field, he and other interculturalists generally found their work marginalized from mainstream anthropology. Anthropologists continued to do work related to the intercultural field, of course, and interculturalists continued to draw upon such work. Beyond the foundational work of anthropologists such as Hall, Clyde Kluckhohm, and others, cultural and linguistic anthropologists analyzed instances of cross-cultural contact, and applied anthropologists considered strategies for easing the problems created by it. There has also been a great deal of reflexive examination of fieldwork by anthropologists that relates. Some anthropologists worked in the intercultural field and considered themselves interculturalists. However, most analysis of intercultural phenomena in anthropology has been cross-cultural, not intercultural, in terms of subject matter and the theories engaged. This remains true today, despite the recent rise in the use of the term intercultural by anthropologists. The history of the estrangement of anthropology and intercultural communication is a complex one, and one I've written about elsewhere with a co-author recently in the volume Student Learning Abroad. Key contributing factors include divergent institutional contexts, theoretical orientations, and disciplinary politics. For now, suffice it to say that motivated to understand the complexity of culture at an ever deeper level, anthropologists became more interested in critiquing borders and boundaries, destabilizing categories, and unmasking the power-laden processes that construct them than in helping people learn to cross such boundaries with ease. In contrast, intercultural communication's central focus has been on culture learning, in helping people adapt to and bridge between differing cultural systems. While anthropologists have tended to probe for the negative in aspects of human existence that might appear positive in the absence of more careful examination, interculturalists have spent a great deal of energy thinking about how one can find positive elements in what seems negative at first. While anthropologists have refined a theoretical toolkit for understanding what are essentially culture-making processes, interculturalists have been focusing on how to construct mutually satisfying intercultural interactions, with important work done in a variety of disciplines, including psychology and education, as well as communication, which became the field's primary home. Distinct and, I argue, complementary approaches. The distinct historical trajectories of anthropology and intercultural communication have resulted in pedagogical approaches that differ in important ways. Anthropologists have tended to focus on teaching skills and frameworks that facilitate the acquisition of deep understandings of cultural systems. Interculturalists, on the other hand, have focused on teaching skills and frameworks that contribute to effective and appropriate interactions in cross-cultural, intercultural contexts. In the case of anthropology, strengths lie in its attention to nuance, complexity, contingency, and the immense variability of human cultural forms. When asked to teach students how to understand other cultures and function across cultures, most anthropologists emphasize precisely these, teaching about cultural difference in ways intended to avoid oversimplification and superficial understandings. By reading fine-grained ethnographies, for example, anthropologists usually seek to convey holistic, albeit partial, understandings of the interconnected workings of cultural systems, problematizing simplistic, socially constructed categories, and emphasizing complexity and contradiction. Often, anthropologists pay special attention to domination and to the ways in which interrelated social, ideological, and economic structures shape and are shaped by the actions of individuals. That is, to the processes that produce and reproduce dominant cultural forms. Anthropological pedagogies tend to be based upon the same principles as anthropological fieldwork, and it is common for anthropologists to interrogate their own field experiences as they consider how best to teach others. Since ethnographic techniques are ideal for achieving a deep understanding of a culture, their use is widely accepted as a highly effective teaching strategy, and anthropologists tend to believe that immersion in another cultural context is the best means for gaining deeper understanding of both the other culture and one's own. In contrast, interculturalists tend to focus on interaction as their preferred level of analysis and typically make use of a definition of culture to refer to the mental constructs shared between members of a group that guide individuals' behaviors as well as their interpretations of the behaviors of others. So it's in the mind. Intercultural communication relies heavily on what I call strategic simplification in its theory and pedagogy. For example, teaching about contrasting cultural values, such as collectivism versus individualism, and making broad generalizations about where each is found. Functioning more effectively in intercultural contexts is the overarching goal of intercultural pedagogy, and there is often an underlying assumption that much of the culture-specific knowledge needed to do so can be gained through interaction with culture carriers. This approach is not as dependent on context as that of anthropology. Interculturalists tend to believe that varied intercultural experiences contribute to increased agility in making use of the culture general frameworks provided by intercultural training. Unlike in anthropology, in intercultural communication, the development of effective techniques for teaching and training has been one of its central concerns since the emergence of the field. Thus, interculturalists have put a great deal of energy into the creation of pedagogical theory. In the late 1970s, when the field entered a period of significant theory building, two kinds of models emerged with distinct aims and audiences. The first type was intended to be used during intercultural interactions by the individuals involved. These models help participants bridge between cultural perspectives cognitively and behaviorally. The second type was pedagogical in nature and was intended for intercultural teachers and trainers who are helping others learn to function more effectively in intercultural settings. The creation of the first type entailed theorizing the dynamics of intercultural encounters. The second required theorizing the process of learning to navigate such contexts and was used to structure training design as well as interventions in learning at the individual level. I now turn to the implications for teaching and assessing cultural and intercultural competence. The last decade has seen a dramatic rise in the number of schools and universities adopting cultural competence or intercultural competence as a primary learning outcome. In these contexts, the terms cultural competence and intercultural competence are often used interchangeably. However, this conflation erases an important difference, and we can, of course, problematize this. I'm really working here on trying to engage productively so that anthropologists can enter into these conversations. This conflation erases an important difference. Cultural competence refers to culture-specific knowledge and the ability to use it appropriately, i.e. skills, in specific cultural systems. Intercultural competence refers to culture-general knowledge and skills that facilitate appropriate and effective interactions in intercultural contexts. That is, in contexts where the participants are guided by differing cultural frameworks. Of course, for true intercultural competence, one would also need cultural competence and the specific cultural frameworks guiding the participants involved in each interaction. The attainment of this type of intercultural competency applicable to all contexts is, of course, impossible. Despite this fact, the term remains a useful one when it stands in contrast to culture-specific cultural competence, thus referring to the acquisition of culture-general skills and knowledge that help individuals function more effectively in cross-cultural encounters, regardless of cultural context, including the improved ability to figure out what culture-specific knowledge would be most helpful to seek out. The tools of anthropology tend to be best suited for facilitating deep understanding of specific cultural systems, or pieces of them, for helping people build deeper cultural competency. Anthropological theories and models provide frameworks that speed the apprehension of interconnected cultural patterns at the system level of analysis. In addition, anthropology students often learn research techniques that enable microanalysis of human behavior, also speeding culture learning. Finally, anthropologists generate culture-specific ethnographic knowledge through fieldwork that can be used by those entering the same or related cultural contexts. All of these help individuals acquire cultural competences, but don't necessarily help build intercultural competence. In fact, a joke among many of my colleagues who are not anthropologists is that for folk who are supposed to know a lot about crossing cultures, we're really bad, actually, at fitting ourselves to systems that aren't our own, or what we want to be our own. The intercultural field tends to support the development of intercultural competence. Surprise, surprise. It provides theories and frameworks for understanding how intercultural interactions generally work. It also provides culture-general frameworks for understanding culture-specific differences that have special characteristics. These carefully constructed frameworks are designed to lead to particular understanding of cultural others. This really is their intercultural frameworks really are an attempt to construct a particular kind of interaction through the intervention of these frameworks. Specifically, they privileged construals of cultural others that facilitate mutually satisfying intercultural interactions. In other words, two people from different frameworks walk out of it going, yeah, okay, I was mostly understood. We mostly met, I was mostly respected, mostly, not perfect, mostly, mutually satisfying. Finally, the intercultural field offers pedagogical theory that explains the developmental processes through which learners learn to construe cultural difference in increasingly complex ways. This last is of use in guiding teachers in curriculum design and classroom interventions. All three of these help build intercultural competence directly for the first two, or indirectly for the third. When put into practice, all three also indirectly support the development of cultural competence as well. A deeper understanding of the most effective uses of each approach in fostering cross-cultural competencies, both cultural and intercultural, is worth cultivating, as each approach has important contributions to make. Understanding these differences also needs to inform assessment practices if such are to accurately reflect reality on the ground. Cultural competence and intercultural competence are two very different, albeit related, goals. Part of the reason they can be conflated so regularly is that anthropologists have largely cut ourselves out of the conversation for reasons explored above and others I can't get into here for lack of time. The reality is that assessment processes are increasingly seizing control of schools and universities, whether or not we like it. At the same time, anthropologists in a number of contexts are struggling to justify our presence. We are perhaps victims of our own success in convincing non-anthropologists that it's worth paying attention to culture. In this context, it is important that anthropologists insert ourselves back into conversations about cultural and intercultural competencies. And sometimes this requires slowing down on the problematization and actually engaging categories as perhaps useful. Both because we have much to contribute to such conversations and because doing so, if done constructively, demonstrates our value in a manner that non-anthropologists can understand and appreciate. If we're successful, we stand a better chance of ending up with assessment practices that illuminate rather than obscure what we are actually teaching students. Always hoping for the best there, but slightly pessimistic as well. But to do so effectively, we need to understand the differences between the two and the ways in which they are and are not interrelated, as well as the distinct processes and pedagogies that support the development of each, including the strengths and limitations of our own anthropological approaches. And I would just end with one last comment that I think we as anthropologists are really good at tearing down. And it's often really hard for us to think about how to construct, and something we can gain from the interculturalists is a way to think about how to construct in a proactive, to use the word I really hate when my students use, way, in an active way that's still consistent with our values and way of seeing the world. Thank you.
Up next, we have Anita Chikatur. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Presenting the paper Shifting Perspectives, How Ethnographic Research Methods Can Help Researchers and Teachers. Anita is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Studies at Carleton College in Minnesota. Her dissertation research conducted at an urban public high school examined processes of racialization as an integral part of creating American national identity, a project being reconfigured as a result of new immigration patterns. Her research and teaching interests include student and teacher perspectives on race, gender, and sexuality, and issues of diversity and difference in educational institutions. Her current research project, based at an urban charter middle school, examines teacher professional development work on social identities.
So 9 months into my ethnographic study at a public charter middle school that I will call Haynes Academy, I sat in on a first session of a Youth Participatory Action Research Group, YPAR group, being led by a local graduate student. 6 middle school students had been chosen by the school staff to participate because they were students that the staff felt were not, quote unquote, engaged in school. During a staff meeting earlier that year, the school's founding director had described the group as a way to, quote, engage a few of our young women who are not as engaged as they should be or they want to be. The overarching theme of the group is climate, culture, and engagement at Haynes. The graduate student said to lead the group told the staff that the goal of the group was to, quote, create student researchers, show and to prove to students and others that they're already researchers. They do that on a daily basis, but they just don't call it that. So this group met for the first time a week later during the students' lunch hour. The 6 students and 3 adults, the graduate student, a high school student working with him, and I, sat around the table in a basement classroom. During the introductions, I was a bit surprised when Camilla, a student that I had observed in one classroom for the past 9 months, talked about how she wanted to be a doctor or a basketball player and how she wanted to go to college. I was also surprised when her classmate, Nikki, gave her a high five at the mention of college. My reaction of surprise led me to become aware of the perception that I had apparently formed of these 2 students as being disengaged. Kaisina Green writes, as she reflects on her work with young people, quote, I dreaded having to admit the degree to which deficit thinking and internalized dominance had sometimes shaped my actions. Similarly, my reaction to Camilla and Nikki led me to examine how I had come to construct a deficit-oriented identity for these 2 students based on my interpretations of their actions in a classroom setting. So this talk examines my shift in perspective on these 2 students that was made possible, I think, as a result of conducting ethnographic research. So following the ethnographic traditions in educational research, I attempted to observe the students in multiple settings at the school and to be reflective about the assumptions that I had been making about them based on my observations. So ethnographic research methods can allow researchers, and perhaps more importantly, the educators who work with the young people, to develop multiple perspectives that defy easy categorization or labeling of their students. And this multitude of perspectives on students, particularly those who are viewed as at risk because of their social positions, remain important at a time when notions of what it means to be an educated person are narrowing because of the importance placed on standardized test scores as a key measure of learning. And I hope that ethnographic research can continue to help us, both researchers and educators, focus on the conditions that produce success and failure and move us away from focusing on the characteristics of individuals. So this year, as I start the process of analyzing the data from the research site collected during the 2012-2013 school year, I will also be working with the teachers at the site around issues of student discipline and how racial identities and biases play into which students are disciplined and how they're disciplined. So therefore, I'm particularly interested in thinking about how to support teachers in making the shift away from the individual and towards culture and structure. So in terms of the context, Haynes Academy is a small public charter school located in a Midwestern city. It enrolls approximately 200 students from grades 5 through 8 and describes itself as a quote-unquote girl-focused school. According to school documents, 50% of the students are identified as students of color, with 25% of those students being identified as African American. The staff, especially the full-time teachers, almost all identified as white and middle class in my interviews with them. When the school was started in 2008, the founding board members made a deliberate attempt to recruit African American families and students. So while this has meant that Haynes has a more racially diverse student body than many of the other charter schools in the city, the school also enrolls fewer English language learners and fewer students who qualify for free and reduced lunch when compared to the public student body in the city. So during the 2012-2013 academic year, the administration had planned to focus staff professional development on exploring how social identities impact the teaching and learning experiences at the school and on implementing a new system of discipline. So I started my research study at the beginning of the 2012 school year with the purpose of examining how effective such professional development could be. And one of the reasons for why they were focusing on social identities was the racial disparities in which students face disciplinary actions. So while the student population was identified as being 25% African American, the year before I started my research, over 90% of the students who were suspended were African American. So unfortunately, the educational director that they had hired to lead this professional development quit at the end of the second day in August 2012. So under the new educational director, the professional development sessions ended up focusing solely sort of on the new discipline system and not so much on the sort of social identity work that they were supposed to do. And this year I was asked to work with the teachers to help sort of support them in their discussion about social identities that they were planning to have last year. And I would like to help them sort of identify structural and cultural elements at the school that contribute to the racial disparities and disciplinary actions. And I hope to draw on the traditions and insights of ethnographic traditions in educational research to help the teachers kind of think about and develop strategies to understand what might be happening in their classrooms that leads to a disproportionate number of African American students being suspended or disciplined. So my main questions as I delve into my data analysis and into working with the teachers are, how can an ethnographic approach help Haynes staff shift their perspective from an individual model of development to a structural and cultural model? How can this shift help them view their students in complex ways and eliminate the structural and cultural features that produce discipline problems? And in this paper, I wanted to think about Camilla and Nikki to illustrate how students were being viewed through a lens where disability and dysfunction were viewed as characteristics of individuals, rather than seeing their actions as being produced by sort of the culture of the school and its classrooms. So when I was thinking about it and I was reading through my field notes for the year for mentions of Camilla and Nikki, I realized that there were actually few instances where I made note of the two students. So they were both in the 5th and 6th grade combined language arts and social studies last class that I observed almost every Tuesday morning from August 2012 to 2013. Camilla usually had an educational assistant working with her, but she was also prone to leaving the class for long periods of time. So this is sort of a sequence in my field notes that's kind of typical and sort of when I did make note of Camilla, and this is from November. So at the beginning of the class, Camilla calls out a couple of times without raising her hand. She wanders around the room and then goes back to her seat. Robin, an educational assistant, is working with her. 9:02 a.m. Camilla leaves the room and Robin goes out with her. 9:03 a.m. Camilla comes back. She's standing by the window. Brian, one of the teachers, is talking to her. She comes to the back and lies down on the couch. Brian says to her, "Camilla, what's wrong?" She doesn't respond. Robin comes back in and comes to talk to Camilla. She returns to her seat. And then about half an hour later, the class has a dance break time, so it's a 90-minute block period, so usually the teachers in the middle of the class sort of play a song and the students can dance along to it, and that's kind of a break time. So during this time, Camilla is sort of singing and yelling and singing along. And after the song ends, Brian says, "Was that too hard? Like anything else, we should practice, our brains will grow." And a little bit later, Brian starts to say, "What I'd like you to do is," and Camilla calls out, "go to sleep." A few minutes later, Brian asks Beth, the other teacher, to find Camilla, who is no longer in the classroom. And a few minutes, like 15 minutes later, Beth comes back in with Camilla, and they go back to sitting on the couch. And I see that Camilla is dictating a story, and Beth's writing, and I assume that she's writing down her story. And then a few minutes later, Beth is reading something back to Camilla, and Beth says, "Look at how much you wrote." Camilla says, "You wrote it." And Bet says, no, it's from your brain. Great job. So Camilla is sort of wandering in and out of class, her participation in classroom discussion, although often in ways not sanctioned by the teachers, and her ability to complete her assigned work, usually with the help of a teacher or an EA, were typical of my observations of Camilla's presence in the last classroom. Nikki, on the other hand, was not mentioned much in my field notes because she did not join the school until much of the school year had passed. So about 3 years into the school year, at a staff meeting, Brian, who's the 5th and 6th class teacher, noted that Camilla was one of the 3 students who, quote, have ceased to remain in our classroom. This student won't come. Camilla is more of a mess. Now she can't seem to, and then Robin, who's a EA, jumped in. Well, the goal is to have her in class as much as possible, but Camilla says, I hate school. And then Farah, who is another EA, says that Camilla would be fine if Farah, could just focus on her, but usually that she's assigned to work with at least 3 other students at the same time. And the art teacher, Heather, adds that she had talked to the school social worker about Camilla, and who had said, about what's going on, and this is Heather talking about Camilla. There's a lack of safety and security at home. She's angry at me, defiant. She's hanging out in the hallway, very, very angry. She doesn't respond well to redirection. So they have this discussion, and then the staff moved on to discussing another student. Right, so many of the discussions during the staff meetings over the year involved this type of identification of individual students who were having behavioral issues, and they generated strategies to work individually with the students. And the staff seemed firmly rooted in a discourse that located differences in ability and behavior and attitude within the bodies of particular students, as Thea Abu al-Hajj puts it, rather than examining what it was about the particular institutional context that made these differences stand out. So that's just kind of what I had seen her in, and then during the first 3 sessions of the YPAR group, Camilla and Nikki were often the most focused and most engaged students in the room. So in one session, for example, the students were discussing body ritual among the Nasarima, which the graduate student had assigned to them. So when asked by the graduate student for the article's main point, Nikki said, what you think it is not always what it is. And then Camilla says, in every story, there's a fib. Right, so the graduate student showed a video that was made by a former student, and Nikki and Camilla were very interested and sort of intrigued by what the video was about, and they tried to sort of explain what was going on, despite sort of disruptions from their peers that attempted to sort of thwart the discussion. So after the session, Camilla actually stopped coming to the YPAR group, and the school year wrapped up, and my research wrapped up with very few mentions of either student back in their last classroom. However, my moment of surprise upon hearing Camilla talk about wanting to go to college stays with me as I move forward with my data analysis and work with the teachers. What will it mean to take seriously at Haynes the notion that while Camilla and Nikki must, quote, remain the unit of contestation and concern, they cannot be the unit of inquiry, as Viren and McDermott put it? What would changes in practice look like at the school if the staff shifts away from discourses that locate disabilities and differences in individual student bodies and towards a more relational view that focus instead, quote, on how differences are produced in specific contexts by virtue of reigning institutional norms and assumptions, as Thea Abu al-Hajj puts it. And in my own analysis and work with the staff, I'm thinking about how do I move away from focusing on individual teachers as the problem and towards sort of culture and structure. Thank you.
Up next, we have Catherine Rodela. Her paper is entitled La Combinación Imperfecta, the imperfect combination, Latin immigrant mothers' cultural crafting in a preschool parent education program. Catherine Rodela is a PhD candidate in the Anthropology of Education program at Stanford University's Graduate School of Education. She received a BA in Philosophy and History at Seattle University and is a former Fulbright Scholar and conducted research with indigenous women in the highlands of Peru. Before starting her graduate studies, she taught Spanish and service learning at an urban high school in Oregon. Catherine's research work focuses on issues of culture, race, gender, language, and equity in education in the lives of Latino students and families. In her dissertation, Catherine examines the way Latina immigrant mothers traverse the complex cultural landscapes in and around U.S. schools, as well as the role of community organizations in connecting immigrant communities and schools.
The title of my talk is La Combinación Imperfecta, or the imperfect combination, Latina immigrant mothers' cultural crafting in a preschool parent education program. Can you hear me? Okay. This paper draws from a 23-month ethnography of Latina immigrant mothers' experiences in the Vamos al Kinder, Let's Go to Kindergarten, which is a name I made up, that's not the name of it, program, a preschool program for Spanish-speaking 3 to 5-year-old children and their parents from low-income neighborhoods in a mid-sized city in Oregon. With my young son in tow, I engaged in participant observations at staff meetings and at over 120 parent workshops and home visits and in-depth interviews with 6 principal informants, 5 mothers participating in the program, and Josefina, the lead parent educator. Using ritual analysis informed by Frake and de Certeau's notions of cultural consumers and bricolage, this paper analyzes how Vamos al Kinder participants and staff combine, tinker, and use different, sometimes contradictory theories around parenting, education, and schooling to create their own uses of parental or parent involvement within U.S. school culture. Over coffee on a typical rainy day in Oregon in April, Josefina Hernandez explains to me what educación popular, or popular education, means to her. This is translated from Spanish. Each person has a lot of knowledge from life, from learning and their background, and each one is different. So when we apply understandings from modern education, it is, I think, the perfect combination, because they themselves value what they already know, but also it opens the mind to learn new things, to learn a different culture, which is perhaps school education from higher levels. When Josefina describes this perfect combination, this is how the Vamos al Kinder program combines popular education workshop techniques inspired by Pablo Freire with ideas and tools from early childhood education. While the children are in preschool classes, parents, and mostly mothers attend workshops about literacy, child development, and parent involvement in U.S. schools. The program incorporates 2 seemingly contradictory notions of parent roles in schools. On the one hand, parents as advocates, which is a Freire-inspired popular education model which focuses on the empowerment of parents, challenging negative stereotypes of Latino families and children, and promoting active, critical roles in U.S. schools. And then on the other hand, parents as teachers, who are responsible for preparing children to be kindergarten ready, originating from child development theories, early childhood education ideas around parent involvement, and often espousing deficit views of Latinos and other families of color or from low-income backgrounds. Now, these conflicting views manifest themselves in the workshop structure. In my informant's words, the Vamos al Kinder parent workshops employ a consistent routine that, after nearly 2 years of participant observation, emerged as a series of ritualized activities. The workshops exemplify a basic theoretical function of rituals, as described by Catherine Bell, a type of critical juncture wherein a pair of opposing social or cultural forces come together. And I found that both the ritualized workshop structures and content were a form of what Levi-Strauss described as bricolage, that is, a creation of something from a diverse range of ideas, tools, or materials. Structurally, the program employed popular education techniques found in many Freire-inspired family literacy and community-based programs. But from the content perspective, so what they were actually talking about, it sought to give the mothers concrete and sometimes very prescriptive activities and advice so that they can teach their children academic kindergarten skills and know how best to talk to their children to promote what they were calling healthy self-esteem and child development. So right now, I want to turn to a specific example of how the Vamos al Kinder staff, and something that's very important for me to note, that all the staff members, so there's 3 parent educators that are in charge of the parent side of the program, that they are former participants. So in many ways, they can be constructed by categories that the mothers that are, mostly mothers that are involved in the program as participants, can be constructed, as in low income, mostly undocumented, they're Spanish speaking, they're most of them are from Mexico and have indigenous backgrounds too. So that's just something really important to understand, that they were actually also participants in the program at one time. So I'm going to analyze a very brief moment back in 2011, which is week 4 at one of the parent workshop groups. So this is part of a ritual analysis table that I adapted from Charles Frake, who was my advisor's advisor. My advisor, Ray McDermott, this is his advisor. And my, oh, never mind, I'll get to that first. So anyways, this is how I'm analyzing the workshop ritual components and functions. And usually, in my analysis, I have the big tables, and I have a part that's about the description of the workshop. So this is very abbreviated. So the theme of this workshop was, Los padres somos los primeros y más importantes maestros de nuestros hijos. We parents are our children's first and most important teachers. So part one included parent-child semi-structured activity, like coloring or playing with puzzles and a reading circle. And all of this was monitored by the staff that manages that handles the child side of the program. So they'd walk around and say, good job, and let them color outside the lines, like they would give them advice. And then part two, the parents would leave and the children would stay, and they would go to their workshop, which included and this is the format for almost every workshop that I observed. So a welcome, a review of the agenda, and introductions. Everyone would go around the circle and tell their names. A dinámica, which was an icebreaker introducing the day's theme, and a cuchicheo, which is usually a discussion in pairs or in small groups, and then a large group reflection, and also a sociodrama, which is, in this case, a moralizing skit. In my research, I construct tables similar to this one, though, as I mentioned before, much larger. And I specifically analyze what I'm calling bricolage moments, which I theorize are specific moments in the ritualized workshop when educators and parents bring together different approaches and theories, creating their own hybrid understandings of key cultural representations, such as parent as teacher in this case. I identified in week's 4 workshop 3 bricolage moments: the reading circle, the cuchicheo, and the large group reflection after the second skit. So the one I wish to analyze here is the second sociodrama, so the last red circle, and the group reflection afterwards. So sociodramas are not simply skits. In popular education, they're supposed to be, so this is supposed to be, they're supposed to help participants engage in critical consciousness. So the notion of being able to critically view what's their systems as they're learning, and the skit themselves should be transformative. So the participants in popular education are supposed to be the ones engaging in these skits. But in the Vamos al Kinder case, the staff are the ones who are doing the skits. And they often perform and use the sociodramas to impart a lesson on how parents can be loving teachers in this case, and engage in specific school-like strategies. In the second skit, when the child comes to the mother and asks her to play with her. So in the first skit, the child goes to the mother and says, Mama, like, play with me. And the mother said, I'm cooking, leave me alone. Okay, so that was the bad one. So this is the good one. The child comes to the mother and asks her to play with her. So this is the 2 parent educators enacting it. The one on her knees is the child. The mother replies, so when the child comes up, Mama, please play with me. Mi amor, necesito preparar la comida, así que vamos a cantar un cantito mientras cocino. Estás aprendiendo el del elefante en tu escuela, ¿no? Vamos a cantar ese. So, my love, I need to make dinner, so let's sing a song while I cook. You were learning the elephant song in school, right? Let's sing that one. So they sing a song, and after a couple verses, the mothers start asking her what is bigger and what is smaller in the kitchen, and all the while she's cooking in the skit, right? And the little girl's really happy, and this is the parent as teacher bricolage moment encapsulated. So everything's in Spanish, and it's supposed to be a moment in daily life that they live. And the mother enacts the role of parent as an at-home teacher by engaging in elaborated school-like language, singing a preschool song, counting elephants, and practicing comparison skills with her child. And after the skit, the group describes what they saw, and the discussion ends with a summation from Josefina, the lead educator, who emphasizes how the mothers can engage in these activities in their daily lives. But then an interruption occurs. A mother sitting there asks a question that's totally not related. So these are when rituals get really interesting, when someone messes with it. So the mother asks for advice about what to do with her teenage son who's rebelling against her and her husband. And she says her son keeps calling them names in English and saying, you don't understand. And she says that she's speaking in Spanish, she goes, y luego dice, you don't understand. and everyone's sitting there like, okay. And Josefina responds in her words, and they had just talked about what their responses to the skit were, and then she goes, Pero de mi punto de vista como mamá, so as my point of view from a mother, she says. And she explains that there are different etapas de desarrollo, development stages that children go through. And adolescents' brains are still developing until they are 19 years old. So her son, she's like, no te preocupes, like, don't worry. Your son is still learning how to distinguish. His brain is still learning how to distinguish between what is good and what is bad. And the mother nods her head. And then Josefina, in that moment, unites the knowledge of child development to occupy the role of an expert. And at the same time, she spoke through her own point of view como una mamá, as a mother, understanding the mother's cultural expectations for children to respect their parents' authority, so that's what you're supposed to do in that family, but with ideas from neuroscience and child development. While the Vamos al Kinder staff employs common activities from popular education, they combine these activities with lessons and tools from early childhood education, ultimately repurposing popular education strategies. They use theories and approaches picked up by parent educators here and there. So, a local family resource center, self-esteem in the brain workshop, or childhood nursery rhymes, or dichos, which are moral sayings, or at-home literacy strategies from the local library's Spanish language outreach coordinator. As Dusserteau described, parent educators have to make do with what they have. And what they have is a smorgasbord of cultural ideas and tools that they use and craft, all in the service of a goal that is ultimately not from them, but from a dominant economic order. The goal of kindergarten ready and parent as teacher, or when the child enters schools, a teacher helper. Okay. These goals come from a scientific institutional enterprise from US school culture called early childhood education, which is presented as expert, ahistorical, apolitical, and simply what is good for all children, okay? But it hides the institutional actors who advocate for access to early childhood education. Institutional actors that, now that I'm done with my research, I will be a part of, schools of education, and other people that I will talk to, right? And it heightens a hysteria on the physical, psychological, and social development of children ages 0 to 5 years, as if a whole person's destiny is wrapped in what had happened to him or his brain the first years of his life. Many, certainly not all early childhood educational ideas depict Latina immigrant mothers from low-income backgrounds with limited formal education who are Spanish dominant and undocumented as unable or unwilling to provide the necessary at-home educational environments to help their children be kindergarten ready. So accordingly, these mothers need to help raise their children to encounter schools that are not child ready. These informants know this is what many Americanos think of them. The parent educators and mothers of the Vamos al Kinder program cannot escape deficiency stereotypes of them or the systems that constrain them. But the trick is that they consume these ideas about themselves and their so-called at-risk children and use them for their own ends and in their own ways. As Dusserteau described, the space instituted by others, whoops, nope, that's not what I wanted, it should be. Okay, the space instituted by others characterize the subtle, stubborn, resistant activity of groups, which since they lack space, have to get along in a network of already established forces and representations. My informants use craft and tinker with cultural representations and practices that many researchers have called middle class or outside their cultural purview. And they cannot escape the dominant social order, but they still move in it, using its representations, sometimes subverting them, sometimes fully accepting them, and sometimes it's perfect, and sometimes it's imperfect. Thank you.
Up next, we have Aaron Hung. He's presenting a paper entitled Video and Conversational Analysis, Classroom Ethnography. Aaron Hung is a graduate of Teachers College. He is currently an assistant professor of educational technology at Adelphi University. Over the past 2 years, he led a project team at the University of Washington to design and implement a year-long 9th grade English language arts curriculum that would both meet the standards of the Common Core and engage students with technology-rich projects. He is currently working on several projects involving video games, learning, and socialization.
So I have some data that I collected as part of a project in University of Washington. I was doing a postdoc there, and we were, it was we were taking research coming out from the learning sciences about what we know about how students learn. And we developed a year-long language arts and biology curriculum. So I was on the language arts team for high school students, for freshmen primarily. And so we wanted to take what we understand about research, so giving them authentic writing projects. So in other words, writing projects that had some real-world counterpart so that they weren't just writing academic essays, although that was also important. And then they were also created, we also had them do project-based learning, so they would, the unit would culminate in a project, a kind of hands-on project in which they have to produce some kind of artifact. We want to engage students with technology, not just in superficial ways, but we really wanted to take technology and deeply integrate it into the learning process. Of course, we want to align it to the Common Core, which is what all this is about. Everyone is concerned about how that's happening. And we were using design-based research, so it was an iterative process. So we had 5 units. Each of them were about 6 to 7 weeks long. So after we designed the unit, we would implement it in a classroom. This was in the Seattle area. And then we would analyze data, would collect the data as it was being implemented. We would redesign it, implement it again, redesign it one more time, and then we would put it together into a year-long unit so that teachers could implement it. And then we would implement the year-long unit, continue gathering data, and then redesign it one more time. And then we would give it to the nonprofit we were working with. It's called EduCurious, if you want to look it up, .org, not now. So what the data I want to share with you comes from a kind of a phase 1 where I was more directly involved with in the classroom data collection. So as I said, this was a high school in Seattle, and this classroom did not have any prior access to technology. Actually, they had some desktops at the back of the classroom which weren't being used. So we were actually there for 14 weeks because we implemented 2 units. So every day for 14 weeks, we wheeled in cartfuls of about 24 laptops. We connected to the wireless network, and so that was how students were using the technology. So the teacher there wasn't using technology. That wasn't a big part of a curriculum. And so these were 10th graders. They had all failed 9th grade English for any number of reasons. Usually it was a family problem. There was some substance abuse. But these were students who were not into like traditional schooling. So this is another reason why we wanted to see if this curriculum was going to work. And so you'll see 2 students. We're going to focus on 2. I'm going to call them Bia and Terry. And they're 16 years old, and they're using this shared Google document to collaborate on their project. So the unit they were doing is a dystopian literature unit. This is when Hunger Games came out. So they read the book. They had to write an essay. And then they had to create a short film. So the process included writing the script and then acting it out. So we're going to look at the short film, the script writing part. Now, I gave them a script template to use. So this is kind of what a script should look like. You have characters, you have the actions, in parentheses, and then you have the dialogue, and then so on, right? And the structure and the format had a particular purpose. And I wanted them to follow that because I thought it was going to be authentic. And of course, they didn't do that. And it was really annoying for me because I said, well, this is a template, and I know anyone who has been a teacher and given templates and students don't follow them, it's really frustrating because you feel like, oh, this is so simple. And as I reflected on it, I think the reason why it didn't work is because if you look back at this, this template has a particular history, right? Filmmakers use it. If you're a filmmaker, you're a scriptwriter or actor or director, you're able to look at this and you can see things. It tells you what to do, right? It's something that has a particular purpose. I would connect it to kind of Goodwin's work on professional vision, right? So when he said it's a socially organized ways of seeing and understanding events that are answerable to a distinctive interest of a particular social group. And in that piece, he talks about coding and about color schemes. And so in a professional world, people take these artifacts and, and certainly in scripts that they're printed on colored pages. And so they have a particular purpose that the student were not part of yet. So that was a moment when I was able to think about how do we get them into that process. And so a part of the unit, part of the curriculum required them to work with scriptwriters and let them see that there is a purpose to the writing. Now I'm gonna, so I hope that you got the transcript, or if you don't, you can share it. And I'm gonna just share with you just this little moment that I found particularly interesting to look at. So this is Terry is on the left. She's in the hot pink hoodie. And then this is Bia. She's the one with the hands on the keyboard. And so they were writing a script. It's a script called Brains for Lunch. It's a zombie movie. This is when The Walking Dead was big, and still is, I suppose. And so basically in this script, they were going into Safeway. I don't know if there's Safeway here. It's like a Whole Foods, I suppose. You go into Safeway, and they find out that people were acting weird. They were turning into zombies. And so they're struggling with this particular line, a moment when the characters find out that people are being strange, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just play this clip, and then we'll talk a bit more about it. Okay. So as it says, this is line 1 through 14 in the script. So the first thing I noticed is their body, the posture, right? They were both facing the keyboard, facing the computer. So this is a shared Google document, so they both had the document on their screen. Now there's a lot of work, there's a lot of work on joint attention, right? So when people collaborate and they have this joint attention on this shared artifact, right? And this is kind of joint attention in a different way because in a sense they're looking at the same artifact, but they're not looking in the same direction. So, and you'll notice that it's kind of hard when you can't type on top of each other. So it's one person, B is the one who's doing the controlling, even though both are kind of chipping in. If you look at the transcript carefully, for example, you would see if B is typing what she's writing a lot, she's saying it out loud. So like in line 5, she says, "Does everyone see like something is?" And then she changes it. Actually, Terry changes it. "Does everyone seem like something is?" And then B takes her hand off the keyboard, and then she starts working with Terry on what is up. And so you see them kind of building on each other's work. I'll play it again if it helps. So at this moment when she looks up, another student comes and distracts her. So I took out that clip. So I'm going to jump right to when they resume their work. You notice in the transcript I have underlined. So what I tried to do there was I was trying to distinguish when they were reading the dialogue and when they were talking about the dialogue. So everything that's underlined is the script, the dialogue in the script, and everything that's not underlined is them talking about the script. And so here's an interesting moment because the teacher, she's walking around the room, and she's going to come over and they're going to ask her for advice. And I'm just going to play that part. I thought it was really interesting how, we talk about, some people are concerned by how teachers might displace, technology might displace the teacher. And I think it was really interesting to see the teacher come over and they ask her a question, and she gives an answer, and they kind of quickly say, oh, okay. And like, in my opinion, her response wasn't that great. Her suggested line wasn't very helpful, wasn't very good. But they kind of took it really uncritically. And so I thought that was kind of a moment where you can see the teacher's role still very much present. And interestingly, in the final draft, they do change it to something else. But it's kind of a moment when you can reflect it as a teacher and say, well, maybe instead of giving you the answer, I should push you to kind of find the answer on your own. Also interesting is to see them really grappling with language, right? They're trying to make it sound like how do you want this to sound, even though it's about zombies. It's still interesting to see them kind of grappling with it. You would also notice that towards the end, you hear some conversation going on at the back, right, which you can't really hear very well. And we were lucky because we actually have this from a different camera angle. So you're going to see this same interaction from a different angle. So the student at the back, the one very much at the back, he's the one who's going to be looking up at line 25, where that asterisk is. He's going to look up and look at what's happening in the front of the classroom. So going back to the posture thing, his posture is very different. He's not facing the computer, and he's actually just looking at his friend who's doing most of the typing, who's doing most of the work, and I know that because I've seen that work. And it's interesting because he wasn't initially part of the conversation, and he hears what's going on, and he becomes part of it. And I thought about Goffman's work on participation frameworks, right? Where he says, when a word is spoken, all those who happen to be in a perceptual range of the event will have some sort of participation status relative to it. So he calls it, I think he calls it something like unofficial participants, where he wasn't part of that group, and then he became part of it because he heard what's going on. And I think it was also interesting that what he says is actually, in my view, kind of ambiguous, whether he was, he was giving a comment to the girl's script, or whether he was offering a suggestion to the script, a suggested line. And the interesting thing about the interaction, of course, is that you hear, like, they heard what they thought they heard, and they responded in a certain way, even though it was actually ambiguous on what they said. Again, interesting, the way the teacher kind of shut down the conversation at the end, where she said, keep going, and that kind of closed the conversation. Again, she could have left it open, but she didn't. So I thought that was just interesting to share with you this little moment of interaction and how the technology came into play. So I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
University of Delaware in a doctoral program in curriculum, technology, and higher education. He recently won a 4-year fellowship from the Chilean National Commission for Scientific and Technological Research. Stephen worked and lived for several years in Chile.
I come from a little bit of a outside perspective. I'm going to try to contextualize that perspective before actually reading my paper for you. I'm a practicing professional in higher education administration. I studied the topic in as a doctoral student, a second-year doctoral student. I have heard about the perspective I bring from some of the presenters. I haven't really heard that much from people with this perspective. So maybe I will raise some interesting topics or problems. I'm going to talk today about what study abroad is. I'm going to pose some questions more than suggest answers. I'm going to introduce something called digital badges and how informal learning or non-curricular learning may apply in the study abroad context. I find it interesting that both groups of anthropologists who are gathered at this conference will hear about digital badges here. Maybe it's a reflection on the newness of these artifacts in education, and that we're searching for a discipline, a home. I'm not sure, but it's notable that that is the case at this conference. A common refrain to hear is that study abroad is transformational. It is less clear why students find study abroad transformational or what makes study abroad transformational. This discussion will propose that transformation in the context of study abroad is similar to how a young person gets involved in participatory media. The study abroad field faces the problem of measuring transformation and credentialing transformation, the two stamps of approval that schooling confers on individuals. We do not doubt the student reports of transformation. So we respond by making teaching and learning moments more intentional so that we can measure them. Yet, if transformation does successfully occur, as we posit it does in study abroad, there must be a method to understand and document what is happening. This is the problem that we suggest to anthropologists and educators. How do we document what we are not teaching, but which individuals are learning? If we can't document or credential intercultural learning, what place do we have to suggest that individuals use schools as instruments to achieve it? At the core tension of study abroad, how do we prove that study abroad provides something different than tourism? In study abroad, intercultural learning lies at the crossroads of one's understanding of the self and the cultural context that the student encounters. According to Bennett's developmental model and others, a learner with the highest level of integrated intercultural competency is consciously constructing dynamic identities for themselves that acknowledge their primary socialization, but that extend who they are into alternative worldviews and cultural bridge building. Bennett explains this intercultural repertoire with an analogy which likens the family context to the intercultural context. Just as an individual learns to be different with their grandmother versus their spouse, individuals learn to do cultural context shifting without any contradiction in their perception of themselves. Empirical results conclude that the duration of study abroad experiences, nor the immersion, in quotes, in a new culture, results in much greater learning for students. The message is that being in the vicinity of an event in another culture does not mean that one has intercultural experience. Whereas successful intercultural learning activities happen when students examine their own cultural assumptions, values, and practices vis-a-vis the assumptions, values, and practices of a host country nationals, and have practice in the acquisition and refinement of general intercultural skills that facilitate interaction. When study abroad students have cultural mentoring, they show the most intercultural learning. And study abroad programs interpret these findings as meaning more mentoring, more student services, more planned travel, more excursions, and more orientation teaching, more curricular and curricular courses, in effect, more schooling. As Squire correctly summarizes, if there is one message coming out of the learning sciences over the past 30 years, it is that learners are active meaning makers who create knowledge from experiences. Video games are fun experiences. They're peer group activities. They reward achievement and expertise. And they are not just about the software. They are about the participatory communities that games inspire, which James Paul G calls affinity groups, or certain ways of thinking, acting, interacting, valuing, and believing, as well as typical sorts of social practices associated with a given semiotic domain. Whether termed communities of participation, zones of proximal development, or affinity groups, the learning sciences have embraced this construct of sociocultural communication and education. Participatory culture is an ethic term that describes individuals working together on mapping insect species in a project in Scouts, making a video of their skateboarding moves after school, or communicating about a shared interest in a video game over the internet. Participatory culture occurs when the focus of literacy shifts from one of individual expression to community involvement. Ito described hanging out, messing around, or geeking out in rich ethnographic terms, portraiture, about how individuals use new media and traffic in the internet to carry out friendship-driven practices and interest-driven practices, which she and her colleagues identify as the broad frameworks for what is most salient in the social and cultural distinctions that differentiate new media participatory culture. Badges are an expression or recognition of an achievement. In the United States, badges are known from scouting, and the badges are intended to stimulate the boy's interest in the life about him and are given for general knowledge. Badges distinguish accomplishments. The accumulation of these badges determines the rank that individuals hold in the curriculum of scouting. And inside the group, badges mark status, and they may lead to distinction or opportunities for the learner outside of the group. Open Badges for Lifelong Learning is a project between the Mozilla Foundation, peer-to-peer university, and the MacArthur Foundation to develop a digital infrastructure for an open source badge system. They define digital badges as an online record of achievements, tracking the recipient's communities of interaction that issued the badge and the work completed to get it. The purpose of this badge infrastructure is to credential learning. The project intends to make learning an inclusive, social, informal, participatory, creative, and lifelong pursuit carried out beyond the single classroom or online space, but instead encompassing many spaces in broader, networked, distributed, and extensible environments. There are systemic implications of removing the power to credential learning from schools and the bodies that oversee schools. The validity and reliability of digital badges will determine if universities and colleges have to face their emergence as an alternative educational credential. Validity answers the question about whether the badge represents the thing it's allegedly designed to represent, and the reliability and credibility that badges are not falsely obtained, or aspects of whether third parties, employers, or others will accept badges as valid representations and credentials. Several questions of validity arise when third parties assess the value of a digital badge, or any credential that an earner presents. In terms of academic credit issued by a university or college, employers, graduate schools, and others already ask many of these questions. Building on work in distributed cognition and constructionism, George Siemens's connectivist learning theory proposes that learning, as defined by actionable knowledge, can reside outside of ourselves, within an organization or a database. It's focused on connecting specialized information sets, and the connections that enable us to learn are more important than our current state of knowing. The evangelists of open badges hope that being able to display a digital symbol of what an individual achieves messing around or geeking out will motivate them to continue to develop these skills and interests. Empirical research on digital badges is still in the early emerging stages, but is looking at theories of motivation, engagement, and learning. And one emerging leader in this area is the Badge Design Principles Documentation Project at Indiana University. Motivation and engagement are key to what makes study abroad transformational. What is no secret that study abroad is an appealing learning activity, or an activity even if it is not a learning activity. The international education field dedicates extraordinary effort to empirically determining where transformation lies in study abroad. From my perspective, this is a very positive development and something that we need to support. However, our psychometric instruments tell us that student transformation is not empirically measured to show the same effect sizes that students seemingly report. So we think something is happening that we cannot measure. In an effort to scaffold the outcomes that our measurements fail to read, and which our theory describes should be happening, we build programs and curriculum to force students into teaching and learning moments based on hypothesis and theory. In this instance, we tend toward the view of the ancient Greek scholar Donald Kagan's higher naivete, the willingness to believe that when students say something happens, in this case transformation, it actually does. As Ito and her colleagues show, this object of analysis is suited to the ethnographic work of documenting everyday actions and the way of being that goes on in the life of a study abroad student. We need to let students show and tell us why study abroad is transformational, so that we can determine through rich description what is going on. I strongly believe that ethnography is the best method of research for this question. The study abroad field is full of professionals and researchers who studied abroad and felt this transformation in their lives and are genuinely searching for how to describe, facilitate, evangelize, and make this transformation explicit. In this discussion, I argue that digital badges are one way to allow students to be authors of their own stories about study abroad, because notions of motivation and engagement and the participatory, informal, constructive, co-curricular nature of intercultural learning. This discussion is also a call for action. It could not be more appropriate for anthropology to take up. Thank you.
Up next, we have a blockbuster group presentation. It is entitled Teaching and Learning, Ethnography for Social Justice. And presenting, we have Dr. Laura A. Valdivieso from the University of Massachusetts. Are you all from the University? Yes. Okay, all from the University of Massachusetts. Yeah. Please take it away.
Oh.
Sorry.
Thank you. We have a lot of bios to read, so it's better if you know us through our presentation. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Our presentation on teaching and learning ethnography for social justice brings together three instructors. One of them is sick, is not here today, who have taught a year-long course of ethnography in several opportunities, together with doctoral students and candidates who are here as well, who have participated in this course, not only as students, but also as presenters. They have come back as presenters, and they have served also as teaching assistants. Each of us is going to reflect upon an important experience in the teaching and learning ethnography in connection to social justice. And in this process, we want to enact how we are building this snapshot of a mosaic where the relevance of our experiences, aside from being authentically ours, is on the implications they bring to understanding the role of anthropology in schools of education, particularly in our College of Education, as it declares social justice as one of its central missions. So the context of our reflections, it's also we're basing how we're interpreting this learning about ethnography as actually the counter story to the lone ethnographer, to the idea of the lone ethnographer that goes in the field and studies these other peoples, and then he comes back and after collecting all the data, writes a true account of the culture. So we are conceiving this course of ethnography as a mentoring course where students are developing their assignments there are individual assignments of the individual ethnographic projects. And so it's a year-long course with 2 instructors, and we work, for example, Denise, my colleague, and I have taught this in several occasions. And we think about this issue of collaboration as the one that I want to discuss today. As, it sounds like a good thing that we collaborate, but how does it take place? And we try to also to problematize that, because we try to enact this collaboration and we try to mentor our students in collaborating. So the students organize, for example, or are organized throughout the semester in different groups. And these different groups discuss their projects, they give feedback to one another, etc. And we work with different groups of students in this process. And one of the years specifically, we were actually challenged by the fact that our students will feel skeptical of the idea of collaboration and the idea of providing to each other feedback. They would prefer someone who was more experienced or had more authority to do that instead of doing peer reviews of their own work. So in these different occasions that we taught, this was the first time that we were introduced to this idea of being challenged. Why is collaboration such a good thing? And we don't really like the idea of giving each other feedback. So we are also aware, we are trying to conceptualize this problem or this issue that we are seeing here with the issue of collaboration, and how in academia there has been attention to collaboration, including ways in which doing ethnographic work in the field includes this collaboration, this participation of different people, including the researcher and the participants. But we consider that there has been less attention to what the collaboration that takes place in the classroom through teaching ethnography is, and what shapes it takes. So here I briefly share with you some of the encounters with these experiences, which has made us rethink collaboration in the context of the course. And for me specifically, in reconceptualizing collaboration as an approach that is pedagogical and epistemologically pertinent as much as it is intrinsically participatory and socially just. The promise of collaboration is reflected in the structure of a course where, for example, students are expected to dedicate sessions during the semester to the small group, as I was explaining before. They review their data collection, their analysis, their framework. For the instructors, the promise of collaboration was envisioned through the opportunity to co-teach and discuss the student work, even providing feedback collectively. However, the very same structures we envisioned for ourselves and the students collided with the structures in place in our own program, where time demands, for example, for instructors, presented concrete limitations to the nature of our collaboration, including issues of seniority and authority in the course. For example, Denise and I have a representation of how we felt. I felt that collaboration was a safe space for for us in the NIS felt that it was a place of vulnerability. And so there were different issues that we have to grapple with as being junior faculty, both of us, but one of us had more experience teaching the course. And so this was also part of the issues of how we perceive collaboration and the assumptions that we had. And another significant experience for me particularly was the one that shook this promise of collaboration where my students were skeptical of it. And I insisted that collaboration was a safe space and that the way in which we represented it in the syllabus was also talking about that safe space where we will collectively constructing knowledge. And, but the students feared being wrong and in their own work and their understanding of the work of others. So one of the quotes that I have from my students is, what if I am wrong? This is going to be a terrible thing if I am out there and I give my judgment about a peer, or in my own work, I am wrong. And so we as instructors weren't focusing on that, being wrong, but on the process itself, as always a work in progress. But in this particular case, the students that we had were focusing so much on that the whole idea of collaborating and co-constructing was really problematized in a big way for us. So I'm going to cut this a little bit shorter because of our group of people here who have come also to share their experiences, but I would love also some more questions about this issue, particularly because we've been teaching this class for many years, and it's one of the classes where we think that we are really building something that will last for the students, not only within this class, but also beyond in the professional community. So we are mentoring through the construction of this community of thinkers, of people who are able to get together and also challenge those power structures as researchers that we have to face. Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to speak to you from the learner's perspective as being a participant in the ethnography course. And I'm going to share with you some of the tensions that I experienced coming into the course with only 1 year of doctoral studies under my belt and still very much in a practitioner frame of mind and not so much of a researcher identity yet. So I call my section Playing House to capture the feeling I had as I was going through this ethnography course. And if you can imagine children playing house, they are enacting and pretending and being something that they aren't yet. But they're using the resources that they've observed and acting out what they have seen. I very much felt the same tension at times because I was in the throes of an ethnography, but yet felt restricted and felt the tension of the course's deadlines and constraints and such, which very much, as you know, goes against, having deadlines goes against this idea of organic ethnographic research. So as I reflect back on my experience, which was 2 years ago I was in this course, October 2011, it started in September, I used the following just to capture it. In essence, I was pretending. I was shaping my ethnography to meet the requirements of the course and not the needs of my potential participants. So the course started in September, as Laura alluded to, and I decided how I wanted to explore how my role as a university supervisor to pre-service teacher contributed to their reflective practice development. That was really what I was curious about. So the course started in September. I was quickly learning about field notes and jottings and everything else that goes along with ethnography, EMIC and EDIC and all the different terms. And on October 3rd, I finally met my pre-service teachers who I would be supervising until January. So then there was this crash course of, quick, let's develop rapport and let's build relationships so that I can study you and you'll sign my consent form. And the clock was ticking and I had deadlines to make and I had a 20-page midterm, mid-year paper to write up. So I needed participants and I was ready to get them. I had them, we were emailing, we were having dessert together, we were crash course on our way to to doing ethnography together. And at the time, 2 weeks later after meeting them, I decided to invite them to my study, and I was all about participatory action research, and I wanted their views and their says, but time was of the essence, and I quickly realized that they were lacking time, as was I, and there was a lot more to conducting ethnography than just getting participants. So I'm now going back to 2011, and this is from a document I called Jottings, and it was more jottings pertaining to the research process. No, I wasn't yet in my site yet. So I say, at this point, 4 out of 5 pre-service teachers have declined participation in the study. I may rethink the study design so as to make it more appealing for the pre-service teachers to participate, maybe less of a time commitment. I feel constrained by the time. I want to make it study participatory action research, or have that element of it, but given the deadlines for the class, how can I get it all done if we spend time exploring an issue together? So you can see this tension I'm feeling as a student, but also as a researcher who wants to conduct valid research. Again, so October 27th, a little bit later, and again, this is 5 weeks from when this report needs to be done. And I do want to stress that it had nothing to do with my instructors. They said, whenever you can get it to us, great. But it was just this, I think, identity I brought into the class as a student wanting to achieve, that I was set on making deadlines and getting my work done. So I revised the study so that the study won't take up time outside of the ordinary supervisory requirements. I emailed Maria, Jose, and Margaret, my course instructors, to update them about my situation and send them my revised proposal, just like a good student would, right? And then I have, and this slide sums it all up. October 30th, I checked my email this morning. I'm surprised to see that more pre-service teachers have declined even the revised study. Why? What should I do? What should I do for the purpose of this class? This is starting to feel very forced. Is all this talk of the study, as much as I've tried to limit it with my pre-service teachers, ruining the relationships I'm trying to build with the pre-service teachers? So I think this really does capture, this slide captures what I learned as a student, and as difficult as it was at the time to be hashing out an ethnography within the constraints of a course, I think it was actually that tension that taught me some of the larger lessons, such as the need for time and limited time, the need to let things happen organically, the need to build rapport in a, I guess, fashionable manner, and not one that is forced. So, so the fact that the ethnography course was, I would say, limited, or had that limiting factors, was actually what caused me to get so much out of it.
All right, so my name is Margaret. I also was a student in the course and also worked with Dr. Vitello the year that Katie took the course. So, but I'm going to be speaking to you a bit from the student perspective as opposed to the co-instructor teaching assistant perspective, and kind of touching upon both of what Laura and Katie just talked about in terms of really looking at this course in terms of scaffolding, in terms of this feeling of playing house, and also this metamorphosis or transformation, and what this course really can provide to their students, or to our students. So we found this quote rather, that says, "We accept that graduate teachers need to teach students the content of their disciplines, but our jobs don't end there. We also need to teach students about their disciplines. That means teaching them what their professional world of their field looks like and how it works, both inside and outside the university." So this kind of goes into this idea of mentoring from faculty to students, mentoring as researchers, and mentoring, mutual mentoring that's happening amongst the students if we look at the idea of collaboration, even if the collaborative process can be a bit challenging. Sorry, doesn't want to go forward. Okay, so If we're looking at it, or I'm looking at it from my own perspective and kind of my own reflections, when I was a student taking this course, and I took the course in 2010, so fall of 2010, with Dr. Valdivieso and Dr. Ives. And one of the things that, if I was going back to sort of my own process, and my own idea of sort of, what does it mean to become a researcher? How do you move from being a researcher? What is the identity of a student who is becoming an ethnographer or a researcher or working within the field of education? And looking at my own ideas and my own jottings in terms of what makes me a researcher and how do I negotiate my researcher status? So this idea of, that Laura brought up in terms of students really feeling like they're wrong, okay? What if I do something, I go into the field and I get this material and I'm just completely wrong? Or I'm wrong when I'm talking with, my peers in the class. The course really forces you to expose yourself in many ways as a researcher, as knowing what you have, like what knowledge you have and what you find within the field. And I think that that's something, it's really wonderful because you grapple with it. You're forced to grapple with it within this space that is a safe space, even if there's a lot of pushback on it. So I think that moving forward, one of the things that I realized, and one of the work that I did within my ethnography is I worked within a community, was looking at heritage language maintenance and revitalization of a group that really wasn't interested in coming together. So I really struggled with that, and I thought, oh my goodness, my project is a complete failure, okay? I remember going in and being like, this is a failure, this is not coming together. But that was actually one of the beauties of it, is really, when you are in ethnography and you are an ethnographer and you are hanging loose and you are in the field and you are trying to get the most out of really understanding the field, you realize that there are so many other pieces there and nuances and really important details that you need to look at, and just becoming comfortable with yourself as a researcher to be able to do that, I think is an important part of the process. And getting feedback from the faculty, for example, there's a paper comments up there, your preliminary data analysis and emerging themes appear promising. I look forward to seeing where you end up. Something like that is very important to, the ethnography student, and understanding that, something, my information, my research, my questions, they're not only important to me, they're not only interesting to my family and to my friends, maybe because that's what I'm used to talking to them about, but they're also important, to other people around me, to other scholars, to faculty, to my peers. So I think it's this development of getting feedback and getting this mentoring and this coaching that moves you a little bit forward. And it becomes, then you begin to realize as a student that, something, you are becoming part of a larger conversation, that their work may have an impact, that there is a lot of transformation that is happening within this year-long process. While you're making your information and your data and your research public, that's a way of transforming as from that educator, from that student, into a researcher, into a student researcher, into a professional researcher, and really sort of framing you and scaffolding your experience as you move forward. And I think that you can't really see this sort of just this identity sort of quote. It's a little bit off the slide. I tend to get really excited with making slides, and it just kind of like put pictures and sorry. I'll have to keep that in mind for the future. But I think that one of the things that is really important and that I took away from the course, and that I really saw when I worked with the other students the year after I took the course, is that you really begin to develop your own voice as a researcher, and you really begin to pull in that self-confidence to move forward, to say, something, maybe I can sit down and write an article about this. Maybe there is something, maybe I can take this in another direction. And one of the things that I have to say is really wonderful about the course that we have at UMass is that we are allowed to begin research within our own areas of interest. We have our own research projects, our own research interests. So that is really fantastic because this is before the dissertation process happens. So you're really able to kind of get into it and become more confident before you delve into the next part of your journey. So I'm going to pass on the...
Just want to make sure I've got all the buttons where they need to be. Hi, my name is Maria Jose Botello, and so I too have been teaching the course with Dr. Ives. And so we rotate. Sometimes I teach part 1, sometimes I teach part 2. And so the three of us have been sharing this responsibility. And this is a required course for our doctoral students. You should also know that Margaret and I have engaged in research on the course. So in some ways, we're doing a mini ethnography on the ethnography course. And we're really interested in its history and the kinds of ways that we are mentoring and scaffolding students' understanding of the genres, so the pedagogies around ethnographic teaching. So what I decided to do today is to share with you a found poem. This poem I constructed out of a lot of readings that we have done related to our research project, as well as some readings that my students right now are reading. And so the title, I call it Writing the People as Epistemology, The Divide. And it's a tension that we see in the research literature. Okay, here we go. What is happening here? Research literature frames qualitative research as processes, practices, and phases. Faculty rarely write about their teaching of qualitative research. Ethnography as a research methodology requires learning from the people, the participants, about what counts as cultural knowledge. Participate, observe, interview, and gather within a bit of life. Taking notice of the social construction of culture through language and use, to write, counter, and partial stories. The research literature creates a division between methodology and epistemology. Ethnography is a philosophy of research, and epistemology, a way of knowing, being, thinking, and seeing, a logic of inquiry. As a logic in use, ethnographers make a range of decisions to choose phenomena. That's incredible. That came out so easily. I should tell you, my first language is Portuguese, so this word sometimes gets caught in my mouth. Observe and write. Construct orienting frameworks to guide participation. Write and observe. Select methods and resources. Participate. Write and read as analysis. Identify perspectives. Link macro relations to macro interactions. Micro interactions. Write field notes. Read. Observe observation. Listen. Transcribe interviews. Write. Observe participation. Read. Collect artifacts. Read. Observe. Write. Field notes. Archive data. Participate. Observe. Turn your ethnographic gaze on their own positionalities and research processes and practices and products. Identify rich points as anchors for analysis and observation. Recognize the boundaries of events, of practices, of relationships, of language. Rich points make visible cultural expectations, meanings, and practices. Make sense of people's patterned ways of perceiving, believing, and acting. Retracing roots and routes of developing cultural knowledge to build warranted claims from emic perspectives, making intertextual, interconnective, interdiscursive ties across time and events, making transparent the logic in use in presentation and publication through thick and thin description. Logic of inquiry, not length of time, guides ethnographers' decisions and work in the field across all processes, practices, and phases of the study. So as we have reflected in our teaching of this course, what we're finding is that we're teaching and learning ethnographically. We're not just teaching about ethnography, we're living ethnography. And so we know too well that our ethnographic gaze is shaped by all of these factors. I think the list is very familiar to all of us. And that also a big part of this course is ethnographic being. And so this list here refers not only to the students, but also to the instructors, so that we all need to hang out and hang loose. I need to get to really know my students' research projects, and I need to be flexible with their timelines because they're walking into people's lives in many contexts. And that we also all engaged in being, participating, and talking with people and with each other. And we're all cultivating a cultural, an understanding of the local cultural knowledge. We know too well ethnographic being fosters an awareness of the social construction of culture power, and they are so tied, so bound together. Developing connection and relationships through thick and thin. It's, it's not always a stress-free zone, and there are a lot of conflicts and misunderstandings, and the misunderstandings lead us to understandings, and contributing to identity construction as ethnographers. So shifts happen. The course blends ways of knowing with ways of researching, with the aim of allowing students to take risks and explore while contributing to students' identity construction as ethnographers. And so that what's happening is students are engaged in the research process from the beginning to the end. And they learn practices more deeply, take risks, take ownership, understand the complexities of researching culture, and develop a reflexive practice or practices, asking themselves, what do I know and how do I know what I know, as the beginning of that work. I'd like to leave you with this quotation from Elizabeth St. Pierre. She resituates ethics, and she argues that ethics are the responsibility of the researcher and the reader. We might consider why we read and respond in the ways we do. This process is about theorizing our own lives, examining the frames with which we read the world, and moving toward an ongoing validity of response, while taking notice that as we acknowledge and are reflexive about the shifting boundaries of our subjectivities, we will find that much else begins to shift as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that wonderful group presentation. And now we have our discussant, Dr. Jill Koyama.
I feel like I should sing my feedback. We read, we had a script, we had a poem. I should do something. So there are strength in numbers. Needless to say, I'm not going to, because of the size of this panel, talk about each individual piece, although I would like to talk what I see the common threads, and then we could talk afterward about your individual pieces. So, oh, and I'm having a hot flash, great. Really? Really, man? Okay, so in writing about anthropology, Ray McDermott has told us that ethnography is radical activity. And Jean Anyon has showed us that in education there are radical possibilities. And these keep me up at night, these thoughts. Because in this meta, data-driven era of school reform, which I would call deform, I'm not sure where the place is for radical activity. I'm not even sure at this point where the place is for radical activity in anthropology, or in education, or when we put them together. I'm not sure where it comes out in ethnographic thinking. So these are the kinds of things that plague me, fortunately not at night, but that plague me and that I've been thinking about. And then this conference comes, and all of a sudden in my email inbox, I get all these papers before the conference, I want to say, so give it up for them, right? This is a first experience for me in that. And I print them out. I actually loaded them on my iPad. I got on a plane with also a very good new piece of work by Karen Russell and the New York Times. I live in Tucson, Arizona now, so the New York Times is a big deal. And I get on a plane, and honestly, I started reading the papers, and I read them all straight through before I read everything else. And I thought, this is it. This is the radical activity. And in each one of these, I see a piece. So I want to talk about what I see as being radical in them, what I see is sticking to what I believe anyway in my interpretation of the tenets of anthropology are. And then I just want to be able to open it up to questions to all of you, since there are many of you and only one of me, okay? So Erin, in yours, I really like the way that you take this real-time discourse textual analysis as it's unfolding, right? Because usually we have the text or we have the discourse and we're going line by line, but you're actually being generated. And this is a very new kind of exciting piece, I think. It also gets at technology. What are we going to do with this as anthropologists in education? How do we see the teacher? Are the roles changing? And you've done a lovely job of putting that together in your paper. Anita, I know your work well. I like it very much. And you do a very nuanced storytelling in this action project where there's reflection, participant observation, and then this very collaborative sorts of rethinking about things. And I think this is a very good new direction for us to go, especially when we're working in formal education settings. The final paper also was incredibly collaborative and performative, and I think this is important, that the ethnography of an ethnography class, right? So layers and layers upon ethnography, and somewhat the way that Nancy was talking about earlier, this monitored ethnography, I think is something that could be a forward activity. Catherine, I like the way you talk about the rituals and enactments and the hybridity of work, and I think that's important. And Stephen, I was really struck by the symbolism and the indexicality of this badge. Okay, so I want one. I'm not even sure what it is, but I want one. If it was not rude, I would have been surfing how to get one, right? So in some way, this has piqued my interest. And again, as you pointed out, we have this new technology piece. All these, I think, are some new, exciting, maybe radical ways of thinking. And when I talk about radical, I'm talking about new, different, emerging, alternative. But at the same time, right, if you look at the Latin meaning of radical, it is the root, right? And we have to, I believe, be true to that in anthropology. It's our discipline for most of us. For some of you, it isn't, and I think that's interesting as well. And you were sure to tell us that, which I also think is interesting, right? I am an interloper, I am an outsider, I'm an administrator looking in, I'm an ethnographer. So I think those positionalities are very interesting, and if I had much more time, I would like to talk to you all about that. But you were very grounded in what I believe are the roots of anthropology and some of our concerns. So we had a very comparative piece. In the first piece, many of us have lost that comparative notion of anthropology, but your work brings it back in. So I want to thank you for that, and a robust theoretical frame, right? We often lose that as well. When we do comparative work, for some reason that falls out. Not your work, Leslie, I'm not talking about you, right? That falls out. And Catherine, your work, it just reminds us that we need to concern ourselves with education largely defined, not schooling, because we could be the anthropology of schooling, and that would not be a misnomer at this point for many of us, okay? Anita gets back to the hardcore participant observation. So I don't know, you're not an anthropologist, you say, but you do really good participant observation, and that's key, right? Being in the field, being there, being immersed. And Erin, you go to something that is a long-standing debate, the micro versus the macro, right? So your stuff reminded me very much of the pictures that McDermott and Varen put of the classroom and the hand raising in the 6 seconds that it took me like 6 months to understand, right? Your work is another take on that. And then the UMass scholars, Katie, Lara, Margaret, wait. Maria? There we go. Okay. They offer this deep reflection, and I don't think anyone who's ever been in an anthropology or an anthropology ed class out in the field has been not told to keep a journal, right? Hopefully no one publishes it after you die, like Malinowski, but you should keep the journal, put a code password on it. And you're doing that actively, and then looking at the journal, reflecting back on the journal as students, and that's amazing. I'm afraid for my students to keep journals. I tell them, don't, please, I don't want to see any of that. But they probably do. But this idea that we need also to be accountable to what we're feeling, right? It's something that often gets lost in academic work, but your work was full of feeling, right? So I found that lovely. Everything was reflective, creative, and also very producerly. So if you've ever read Fisk, John, he talks about texts who are producerly. You can be readerly or producerly. Your work is producerly, right? You're constructing meaning, you're interpreting your meaning, you're reflecting on it, and you're creating new knowledges. And to me, I think that's the direction that we need to go in our radicalness. So I thank you.
Hi, thanks for the question. What's your name? Joe, hi. When the teams go out for research, we all carry with us 2 cameras. And as I was kind of looking through the video, it occurred to me how, strangely that that sometimes being a data collector is kind of like a filmmaker, right? You point the camera in a certain place, you cut it at a certain point, and you start at a certain point, you cut it at a certain point. I mean, you tell a story, right? And so I thought that was, I kind of, you kind of wish that there's some kind of camera that doesn't have, that is kind of more neutral. And so, but we can't do that. So in terms of why we found that camera, we were just, it's tricky doing classroom ethnography because we were trying to capture data broadly, so it wasn't, we weren't looking for anything in particular. So as the unit was being implemented, we would look to see, well, what are some interesting possibilities, and then we would try to capture. So what you actually saw was actually 3 cameras. There was one in front, one in the back, and then one that was actually on a bookshelf facing camera. And then sometimes the students would go to the library, and so we would chase them out with a camera. But it's really complicated, and I wish that there was a solution, or like, to, I know people are kind of working on smaller cameras and more portable cameras and so on. But I think that is a kind of attention and finding where you point your camera and knowing where you point the camera to begin with. So I don't know if that addresses your question, but a little bit.
So I was with them for 2 years, and I'm still in some ways with them. They still know me. And I think it's important to make a distinction. I needed to maybe make a clearer distinction in my presentation that the women running the program were themselves mothers. They had gone through the program, and they're using, I guess the main thing is they're using all these different ideas. And so in the interview that I talk about with Josefina, and that's not her real name, but the point of the interview, because I had done already a bunch of different interviews with her, and I've known her, and she's probably really my main informant, is that I was confused, and I found myself finding all these contradictions, and I could take it in the and double binds. So as Bates had talked about double binds, and it's really critical, and it could have been a really interesting conversation about the contradictions. And actually, the original title of my paper was Contradictions. But what I found was that that's not how they see it. They see it I went back and I asked them, and I said, I see these contradictions. Am I right? Or am I crazy? Because I'm telling them that this is different than what Freire and with who they aspire to, the things they aspire to do. This is very different. It constructs the families and the mothers in different ways. And they say, oh yeah, you're right. Exactly. And that's how we're doing it. And that's the way it is. And so they feel that they're doing this work of empowerment, and as in Josefina's words, it's prendiendo la luz, turning on the light. And it isn't because they don't regard what they're doing, the practices that the parents do and what they're already doing as valuable. They do very much do that. But that they're recognizing that they're in these no-win situations with U.S. schools. And so, but the thing is, and then maybe last month I did a presentation on my findings in Spanish to the group, the staff. And I did talk about, maybe not in the same ways I'll talk about it here. I'm not going to cite de Certeau and these theorists, but I did very much explain to them that I saw that they were doing these 2 different things, and they were like, yeah, you're right. For them, it's not tension-filled and imperfect. It's really part of their lived experiences. And but I think something that they could do, and I did mention it, and I said, maybe explicitly talk about the politics of education that you guys really have, because it doesn't come across as much. And they were like, oh, that's interesting, and maybe we'll do that. So maybe, I don't know. So I don't know if that answers.